And this is my new tutorial about the manual shading and using color buffers in rendering setup. And this is part 1, where I show you what you could achieve without using any GLSL. And in part 2 I would explore the same technique but with some extra help of GLSL. And I discovered the render buffers recently when I did my research on point clouds and voxelization. You could see it in another tutorial. And interestingly, it's not very popular among people. I think so, because in Facebook group or in derivative forum there is not so much questions and answers and sharing with render buffers workflow. But in my opinion it's very interesting tool to explore. And first of all, let me show you the basic setup, and then I'll quickly go through some of my findings. But mostly it's about your own experimentations. So don't expect that I show you how to create some specific effect, but rather than I show you the idea and your task is to explore this idea. Okay. Here we need a simple render setup. I'm a big fan of a torus because it's quite complex by itself, but I made it a little bit more complex with a twist, and then I need a texture to show you some of tricks and attribute create in case if we will start talking about normals and vertex displacement. And of course we need the geometry. Okay, let's arrange it a little bit, and twist, let's add something like, yeah, this is good enough. And to make it looks better, let's increase the number of rows and columns. Okay, that's good. And in attribute create, I choose compute tangents, and also I need the camera, and I prefer to have a lighting as the child of camera, so they both look at the same directions. But I will shift light just a tiny bit, so it not looks the same as a camera, but from some kind of angle. Okay, I need my render. It looks good, and to make it more dynamic, let me EBS time frame multiply by 0.5. Yeah, it's good. And maybe this. Yeah, good. Quite complex, and you could see many details. Alright, what is render buffers, and why should you or could you use them? Oh, by the way, I forgot about matte. Here I could use the Phong matte or PBR matte, because they have a special advanced step with all of that color buffers set up. And I would like to have some kind of color map. I would use the noise, call it texture. Let me increase the resolution to have more details, and also, alright, this should work. And I would like to have a normal map, just to show you that you could use the vector the normal bumps and vertex displacement. Level, maybe increase the contrast a little bit to make it more bumpy. Is it bumpy? Not super bumpy, but okay, maybe just a little bit more. And maybe decrease. Okay, we could set up it later. But alright, I see some bumps. Good. And I would also use enable hide map, do displace, and this I will use the same texture for displacement and displace just a tiny bit to make it even a bit more noisy. And in texture, what kind of axis do we have? We have Y, or maybe Y would be good. Maybe, or my perspective from camera. Alright, so let's talk about the render buffers, because it's a main topic and not all of this just aesthetic decisions. By default, the Touch Designer renders everything and do all the shading automatically by itself. Here, for example, the Touch Designer uses the Fonk model, and you could read about the Fonk model and how it's constructed in Wikipedia. It's basically multiplying diffuse and ambient by using workspace, position, normals, and some other stuff, and adding specular, and that's it, and then applying a texture. But if you would like to have some effects on it, for example noise or feedback loop or something else, displays, you could work only with this render as a whole. But sometimes you would like to have a more manual approach and have more opportunities to do it by yourself, to add some tiny changes. And that's the place where render buffers could be helpful. So you need to use the render select, and pass your render top here is the kind of the same as the render pass, but render pass allows you to save the GPU and CPU power if you render the similar scene with different geometries or with different cameras or something else. With the render buffers, however, you have only one setup, but render different parts of lighting or shading. We have exclamation sign here, and because there is no color buffer, because you need to set up it. Here in the render in advanced tab, right now we have only one color buffers and this default render top. So I could increase this, and the amount of color buffers, it depends on your graphic card. For example, my video card supports only 8 color buffers, so I would use 8. Your video card maybe allows more or less color buffers. But usually there is 4 or 5 color buffers should be enough for very interesting manual stuff, manual shading. Okay, and next you go into Fonk, go to Advanced, or on PBR, go into Advanced tab, and here you could choose what to display on this render buffer. For example, right now it's 0, so it's just 0. If you choose 1, it's like a mask for geometry, which could be helpful for some masking. You could choose, for example, camera space position, or you could add a lot of so right now you could add 7 because this is number 8. And for example, camera space position, camera normal. I would like to have a texture coordinate, maybe diffuse, final specular, and 1. And I think that's enough for demonstration. And I would use a simple Python trick. Type in me.digits, and this allows me to use this number in operator as a parameter for some, as a value for some parameter. For here I have number 1 and here I have number 1. So if now I copy paste it, I would have different color buffers with different picked color buffer index. Alright, that's basically it for render setup. And now let's talk what could you do with all of that. As I mentioned earlier, it's mostly your own experimentation. There is no some specific tricks, some specific technique what you could do, but you could experiment. And let me explain a little bit about different buffers. The normals here are good for some lighting. Here, interesting one, the camera space position. You don't have the world space position, unfortunately, without GLSL. So maybe we'll talk about it on the part 2. But with camera space position, you have something similar to, for example, Kinect depth point cloud camera, where you have red pixels. Oh, it's 0 because I need to pick pixel format a little bit more details. So now you could see the right color indicates the horizontal position, green vertical position, and the blue is Z position, so it's depth. And you have only negative values in the blue because it's a 2D camera and there is no geometry behind the camera that is visible. Probably if you would use, for example, here 3D, some cube map, for example, it maybe would be very slow right now. Let me pause. So here maybe I'll get somewhere positive blue values. Well, maybe not. Okay, doesn't matter. Anyway, you could use, by the way, 3D render mode as well. Okay, let me go back to 2D mode because it's a main focus here. And the blue values here, it's kind of similar to depth. So you could use this instead of depth, because in depth top you need to select here some value, you need to rearrange from camera space, find the good values for rearranging, and you have some values. And here you have values from camera space. If you pick right now monochrome and on the blue values, you have a very good. Why doesn't it work? Let me. What's going on? I don't understand what's going on. Luminance. Okay, red works, green works, and blue. That's weird. Okay, anyway, here we have a blue values that's negative, and probably I did something wrong here. I'm not sure what exactly, but just not to spend your time, let's forget about this. You could use some different, oops, yeah, I have some bug as well. You could maybe use reorder to get these blue values as a monochrome. Anyway, probably the depth is even simpler for you. I don't know. One of my favorite is this one, is a texture, or how it's called, the texture coordinate. It gives you information about how the texture, this one, texture would be applied to geometry. And sometimes it's kind of tricky to understand how texture is applied. And this render buffer could help you to understand. And here I have a texture soap. And if I pick the other option for applying the texture, as you could see, the texture is applied differently, and it could be very useful if you try, for example, pick the option here that, for example, doesn't have really visible pronounced seams, like for example here, perspective for camera, there is super visible seam here, which is kind of ugly. And with orthographic it's almost invisible. Very good. Invisible seams. Good. That works. So let me leave orthographic here. What else could be useful with texture coordinate? If you remap the texture coordinate with your texture, oops, if you do it differently, and here is this mask could be very helpful. It's a render buffer with value 1, so you could very easily cut the scene that's not a geometry. And here, if you compare, it's the same places for texture. So that gives you the possibility to, for example, to do something with texture here. And because, for example, if you would like to do some HSV adjust or feedback loop or displacement with render, it will be applied to the off. And for example, with this, it would be applied to this specular shining. And sometimes you don't want to, your feedback would be to apply your feedback to lighting and to this shining, but you would like to have this in texture. So you could do everything you need with the texture, and then what's going on? I don't get it. And then you could, okay, that's good, and maybe add the specular here. So right now we have almost the same setup like our initial rendering. But if you use not the same texture but do something with texture, you would have some strange bug. Or you could use absolutely different texture move a file in. You could use the banana, and here banana applied to torus. But as I said before, it's up to you what and how works with all these setups. What else? Here is final diffuse, which is good for some multiplication. Here's only specular car, so maybe you like to apply noise to the specular. So where the light hits the geometry, it could be some kind of displacement or whatever. In my setup, in my approach, I really like to use some tops that deforms the look very drastically, like feedback loops, displacement, what else, HSV adjust for changing colors, maybe lookup, and some other tools. So let me try to quickly create something. Let's use feedback. Let's add a bit of noise, a little bit of noise, maybe not monochrome, maybe a bit higher, and apps times seconds multiplied by 0.25. All right, good. And let's add I don't know, let's try to add edge. Maybe it would be too much, I don't know, but let me leave it like this for now. And let's do some composite here with something that I like. I don't know, usually soft light works well. And of course I need to go into target top. So maybe I'll add, because here I have some super tiny details, so maybe the blur could be a good decision. Alright, let me turn off this render select and turn on this. Alright, here we have already some not super crazy but interesting effect that looks like it like all of this displacement going on inside this geometry, and it's not the same as if you apply the same setup for the render. And now you could of course use this. Oh, it would be interesting to see how it affects the texture. For example, let me do a remap. Oops. Let me do a remap once more. And again, I would need to multiply it. Multiply, where are you? Here are you. Multiply. Right, good, and let's add basic diffuse and specular shading. My setup. Here I need to use maybe multiply. Yay! And I have such crazy displacement inside the geometry. Of course, right now it's not super fancy. You need to work more and adjust every parameter and maybe add some more composites, add some more tools here. But my point is that you could create either very crazy shading, or maybe you could apply just a tiny bit of shading, or maybe you would use it in some different ways that I don't know yet, that I didn't discover yet. So right now let me leave this basic setup, and I want to show you some of my example that I made previously. And again, it's not some kind of smart decisions or smart understanding of how everything works, but mostly it was just a trial and error and a lot of experimentation. It took me about 1 hour or maybe 2 hours to set up all of this, a lot of remaps, composites, HSV adjust, and I end up with some iridescent crystal-y look. Or here, for example, I used some of the techniques that from recent Packeta 12 tutorial about recursive displacement, and I achieved some kind of smoky stuff inside the geometry. And I'm not sure which one I prefer. This one is a jelly thin, or this one transparent liquid thin. And again, it was just an experimentation and trying to apply different stuff. You could try to use, for example, reaction diffusion, displacement, just a normal feedback loops, and God knows what. You could try and do everything. And the last thing, with some technical details, instancing. You could you do the same with instancing, and the interesting thing here is what I discovered is that very helpful could be the point color buffer. And point color gives you the colors of your instances. Here is it, and here is my colors. It feeds into instances page, into color mode, and you could use this to pick some of instances. You could pick some instances. For example, here I'm picking it by just using threshold, and I have two different setups. I have one setup with one kind of effect, some more like watercolor, and another effect with simple reaction diffusion. And then I use this threshold masking to pick some of my instances. So in one render setup, without using different geometry, different font shading, so with only one render setup, I have instances with two different textures. And of course, you could use much more than two. And to show you it a little bit with a little bit more precision, here I have 27 points, and here I have a ramp that's set from value 1 to value 27. And with limit, I round these numbers, so now I have a ramp goes on red channel from 1 to 3, 4, 5, and so on till 27. So if I pick it here for my colors and go back into this color buffer, now I have every instance show its number here. Here, for example, instance number 4, here instance number 24 and 15 and 27. And you could pick it as well with, for example, threshold. You could pick equal, the threshold, for example, 20. And here is it. This is instance number 20. And sometimes you have some artifacts. I try different methods with nearest pixel, with interpolation pixels, but I couldn't get rid of artifacts all artifacts, but you could blur them out or do some other kind of masking to get rid of it. So here mostly I don't have it, just in tiny bit on some edges. Alright, probably that's it, and now I have only one instance with reaction diffusion, but mostly it's because I have super bright colors, goes up to 27, because it was set up for the other option. And right now I could encourage you to do your own experiments based on your own Touch Designer experience, your favorite feedback setups and other tools that you know, and spend some time and share the result that you could get with it. And as always, I thank all of my patrons on Patreon, and if you would like to support me, you could do it on Patreon, and as a bonus you'll have this file with my 3 examples that probably could give you some other ideas if you explore them and maybe change some parameters. But still I encourage you to do your own stuff, because as I said, it's not some kind of smart setup, it's just the result of my experimentations. So if you spend 1 hour or 2 hours with your own setup, maybe you'll get some much more beautiful based on your own aesthetic choices. And that's it for today, and after a week or 2 I'll do the second part with GLSL, because with GLSL you could have more parameters going out, not only this stuff that we have here, but maybe some more. I have some problem with my camera. Okay, so, and that's it. Thank you for watching. Goodbye. Make art, have fun. Bye.